Welcome to the debate. Imagine sitting across from someone who is weeping, visibly shattered, completely paralyzed by self-doubt.
Right.
And your nervous system just screams at you to lean in, right? To comfort them, to protect them. The distress is so palpable. It's radiating off them like heat.
It feels like an absolute emergency.
Exactly. It feels like an emergency. But what if this exact display of profound vulnerability, the tears, the helplessness, the absolute martyrdom, what if it is actually a highly sophisticated, invisible structure of interpersonal control?
You're describing a psychological hostage situation masked as a rescue mission. And, well, that is exactly why this topic is so endlessly complex. We are investigating covert narcissism today. When most people hear the word narcissist, they immediately picture the grandiose stereotype, right? The loud, brash, extroverted character just taking up all the oxygen in the room.
Demanding total admiration.
Exactly. But today, we are pulling back the curtain on the quiet, the introverted, and frankly, deeply anxious presentation of this personality. It's a hidden world that often goes completely unnoticed until you are trapped inside it.
And our core disagreement today centers on the true nature of this hidden presentation. I approach this from a trauma-informed perspective. My position is that covert narcissism is fundamentally a disorder of profound emotional fragility.
Okay.
It is rooted in early developmental deficits, toxic shame, and an overwhelming, really biological fear of rejection. I believe these maddening behaviors, the sudden withdrawal, the hypersensitivity, the profound depressions, they're unconscious. Desperate attempts by a wounded self to survive in an environment they perceive as perpetually threatening.
I come at it from a different way. While I acknowledge the emotional distress is occurring, the pain is there, I argue that this presentation of vulnerability is actually a highly effective covert manipulation system.
A system.
A system, yes. The victimhood, the introversion, the apparent helplessness, these serve as a functional facade. They mask a deeply antagonistic core of entitlement, utilizing emotional dysregulation, not just as a reaction, but as a primary tool for relational recruitment and interpersonal control.
Well, to really understand my perspective, we have to look at the developmental foundation, specifically Margaret Mahler's theory of separation individuation. For a child to develop a healthy, secure sense of self, they have to gradually separate from their caregiver.
Right, that's basic developmental psychology.
Yes, but this process requires the caregiver to be a stable, reflective presence. When caregivers fail to provide consistent emotional mirroring, maybe they are profoundly cold or, they only value the child when the child performs well, that psychological separation is violently ruptured. Heinz Kohut's self-psychology actually calls this a failure of self-objects.
Let's translate that for the listener, because self-object sounds incredibly clinical. What we are really talking about is the parent functioning as an external battery pack for the child's self-esteem, correct?
That is a perfect way to phrase it. A healthy parent acts as that battery pack until the child can generate their own charge. But because of that early failure, the covert narcissist never undergoes what Koot calls transmuting internalization.
They lack the hardware.
They never download the internal psychological software needed to self-soothe or regulate their own self-worth. So the absolute core of the covert narcissist is what schema therapy identifies as the vulnerable child mode.
Right.
It is an internal landscape just consumed by toxic shame, their introversion, their hypersensitivity to criticism, their constant anxiety. These aren't calculated Machiavellian tactics. They are the genuine experiences of a fragmented self desperately trying to outrun their internalized bedrock conviction that they are fundamentally defective.
I hear the tragedy in that description. I really do. But I simply don't buy that framing when we look at how this disorder operates in reality. If we bring in Otto Kernberg's object relations perspective, we see a much darker structural reality.
You mean the grandiosity?
Yes. The fragility is there, sure, but it is intrinsically bound to a pathological grandiose self. In the grandiose narcissist, this entitlement is overt. They tell you they are the best. In the covert narcissist, that grandiosity doesn't disappear. It is just driven underground into a rich, dissociative fantasy world.
But that retreat into fantasy is a protective mechanism. They are protecting themselves.
It is a protective mechanism that functions as an extraction system. The introversion and the depression aren't simply trauma responses. They are defensive strategies used to extract validation in narcissistic supply without ever having to actually compete or risk failure in the real world.
I mean, that sounds highly intentional.
It is highly functional. By constantly playing the martyr or the perpetual victim, the covert narcissist completely avoids accountability. They get to passively assert an intellectual or moral superiority over everyone else without doing the work. It's a brilliant, if highly toxic, extraction mechanism.
To call it an extraction mechanism implies a predator-prey dynamic. And to understand why it looks like that to the outside observer, we have to understand the internal cognitive nightmare the covert narcissist is living in. Edward Torrey Higgins's self-discrepancy theory is crucial here.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Higgins maps out how humans compare our actual self to our ideal self. But David Ogilvy expanded on this by introducing the concept of the undesired self. It's the absolute worst version of ourselves we dread becoming.
Which, for the covert narcissists, is the average, defective, rejected version of themselves.
Right, exactly. A healthy person operates in what's called locomotion mode, which means they are moving forward toward goals. But a covert narcissist is frozen in chronic assessment mode. They are relentlessly, obsessively evaluating their actual self against this terrifying, undesired self.
Always comparing.
Always. I want to offer an analogy here. Imagine a burn victim who's missing their protective outer layer of skin. Even a gentle, ambient breeze causes excruciating pain.
Wow.
The covert narcissist's ego is that burn victim. Their hypersensitivity to criticism isn't calculated to control you. It is a raw, neurological pain response. We actually see this in neurobiology. Research shows that during experiences of peer rejection, the covert narcissist's anterior cingulate cortex and insula,
The exact brain regions responsible for processing physical pain.
yes, they light up catastrophically. They are in actual blinding agony when they feel criticized.
That's a compelling argument, and I acknowledge the reality of the pain. The burn victim feels the burn. The brain scans don't lie. But what happens next in the interpersonal dynamic? Let's look at the behavioral forensics.
Okay.
Trigger, manipulation, victim confusion, guilt, compliance, control restoration. By reacting with intense resentment, devastating pouting, or passive-aggressive silent treatment to any minor feedback, the covert narcissist effectively trains everyone around them to walk on eggshells.
You're suggesting the pain is actively weaponized.
It absolutely is. Let's ground this in a real-world scenario. Think about a marriage. If every time a wife asks her covert narcissistic husband to help with the dishes, he undergoes a devastating shame spiral.
He feels attacked.
Right, and he starts talking about how he's a terrible provider, how he can't do anything right, he threatens to sleep on the couch, and now she has to spend 3 hours soothing him. If you're listening to this and thinking, well, wait, that just sounds like depression, here is the crucial difference.
What does she learn?
Exactly. What does the wife learn from this cycle? She learns to never, ever criticize him. She learns to just do the dishes herself. This defensiveness acts as an offensive weapon. It's an invisible control structure that shuts down any threats to their concealed grandiosity. The insecurity itself functions as the leash.
See, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it implies a level of conscious premeditation that contradicts the neurobiological reality of a trauma trigger. Are we really going to criminalize a biological panic response?
It's not about criminalizing.
Is this a conscious weapon, or is the distress a biological imperative to seek safety?
Conscious or not, the payoff is identical. It maintains a closed system where their emotional needs entirely dictate the reality of the relationship. It's operant conditioning of the partner.
But we have to look at what happens when that fragile system completely fails. This brings us to the phenomenon of narcissistic collapse. Building on the fragility we just discussed, when the covert narcissist defense system is overwhelmed, often triggered by a private relational severance, like a partner leaving or a massive professional failure, they don't just get upset.
Now, they completely unravel.
They undergo a genuine psychological decompensation.
Without the subtle relational attunement, the narcissistic supply they rely on to regulate their self-esteem, their internal structure literally floods with unprocessed emotions.
The mask doesn't just slip, it shatters.
It completely shatters. They sink into profound, debilitating depression. It's a total unraveling where the vulnerable child mode takes over, resulting in extreme emotional helplessness. And I want to be clear here, this isn't standard depression, which involves genuine internalized grief and mourning.
Right, it's different.
This is an acute state of panic because their identity feels like it is fragmenting. They aren't scheming in this moment. They are psychologically drowning.
Well, let's examine the outcome of that drowning, though. If we look at the clinical observations of experts like Annie Wright, we see a highly specific, repeatable pattern. This collapse operates as a massive recruitment mechanism.
A recruitment mechanism.
Yes, the operatic helplessness, the catastrophic weeping, the sudden inability to perform basic daily tasks, and yes, sometimes even threats of self-harm. What do these behaviors actually accomplish in the real world?
They signal extreme distress to anyone who will listen.
They do much more than signal. They are designed to pull caretakers back into proximity exactly at the moment those caretakers are trying to establish healthy limits. It weaponizes the victim's empathy.
But it's real suffering.
This suffering is absolutely real, but it is actively utilized to bind others to them through guilt. It triggers the partner's trained hypervigilance. The victim's nervous system goes into what we call polyvagal overdrive.
That freeze response?
Right. If you're listening and you felt this, it's that sudden freezing sensation. Your heart starts racing, your stomach drops, and your brain screams that if you don't step in and save them right now, a tragedy will happen and it will be entirely your fault. It is a psychological hostage situation.
I have to challenge you on this framing. How do we draw the line between a conscious, sadistic manipulation and an unconscious, desperate survival mechanism triggered by fearful avoidant attachment?
By looking at the patterns.
But you are describing a person in freefall who reaches out and grabs the nearest person to break their fall. Yes, it hurts the person they fall on. Yes, it pulls them down. But characterizing it as a recruitment mechanism implies a level of Machiavellian foresight that completely ignores the sheer panic of an unmirrored, fragmented psyche, losing its only anchor to reality.
We draw a line that looking at the longitudinal cycle. If you pull someone down with you once, it's a tragedy. If your collapses consistently happen exactly when your partner attempts to set a boundary, and suddenly they are forced back into the caretaking role, abandoning their boundary, that is a behavioral algorithm.
An algorithm.
Yes. The covert narcissist may not have a conscious whiteboard where they map out this strategy, but they learn very quickly exactly which levers of helplessness yield the supply they require to stabilize.
Okay, well, following the collapse, we also have to analyze how the covert narcissist attempts to restabilize their ego and interact with their target. Often they retreat. We see profound social withdrawal. They might ghost their partner, stonewall, or completely disappear from public view and social media.
Which serves a purpose.
From a trauma standpoint, this is a protective retreat. Because the real world has proven too painful and their actual self is dangerously exposed, they withdraw into maladaptive daydreaming.
Right. They retreat into a fantasy where they are finally appreciated.
Yes. They build a rich, dissociative, internal fantasy world where their grandiosity is safe from the pain of real-world rejection. They aren't withdrawing to punish their partner. They are fleeing an unbearable reality where they feel utterly defective.
See, at first glance, this seems harmless. It looks like typical depressive isolation. But here's what most victims never realize, and this is where the behavioral forensics get incredibly dark.
How so?
During this post-collapse phase, we frequently see what is clinically termed symbolic intrusion. The covert narcissist won't reach out directly. That risks actual rejection and requires genuine vulnerability, which they cannot tolerate. Instead, they use highly deniable indirect behaviors.
What does that look like in practice for the listener who might be experiencing it?
Well, they might subtly repeat an inside joke to a mutual friend, knowing it will get back to the victim. They might visit a highly sentimental restaurant they used to share with their ex-partner and make sure they are seen. They might leave a specific piece of clothing behind that they know carries immense emotional weight.
or engage in destructive behaviors.
Right. Interestingly, research shows they might engage in casual sex purely for coping motives, conforming to peer expectations just to numb the pain.
Which heavily supports my point, right? It's coping. It's a desperate attempt to avoid pain.
But the symbolic intrusion is targeted. It is a calculated move for plausible deniability. Think of it like leaving a psychological landmine in the victim's living room.
A landmine?
The narcissist doesn't even have to be there for it to go off. It allows them to reassert dominance and maintain a psychological hold over their target. They are intruding on the victim's emotional space, forcing the victim to experience a wave of nostalgia and ruminate on the relationship without the narcissist ever taking a single ounce of accountability.
And if they are called out?
If the victim confronts them, the covert narcissist can easily gaslight them and say, "Oh, you're crazy. I just happened to go to that coffee shop." It's an invisible leash designed to keep the victim completely off balance.
I view that mechanism differently. To call it a psychological landmine assigns a predator-prey dynamic to what is essentially an attachment panic. They want connection, but are terrified of the vulnerability required to get it. But, we can't fully unpack these dynamics without zooming out to examine how society shapes these underlying psychological mechanisms into recognizable patterns.
That's true. There's a deeply gendered component to how covert narcissism manifests.
We have to look at the socialization of traits.
Right. Overt, phallic, narcissistic behavior. So blatant arrogance, aggression, physical dominance, explicit entitlement is often permitted or even rewarded in men by society. Women, however, are heavily socialized differently.
To be accommodating.
Exactly. Think of the mythological figure of Echo, who was doomed to only repeat the words of Narcissus, having no voice of her own. Women are culturally conditioned to regulate their self-esteem through what we call anaclitic dimensions.
Meaning they gain their sense of self through excessive dependence on relationships.
Yes, relational self-esteem. They are taught to idealize a partner, display immense self-sacrifice, and internalize their depression rather than externalizing their anger. Covert narcissism often aligns perfectly with this feminine socialization.
The suffering becomes the identity.
The narcissistic supply is gained by being the ultimate martyr, the most selfless mother, the most long-suffering, misunderstood wife. The grandiosity is hidden beneath a socially acceptable veneer of hyper-empathy and sacrifice.
I can see the socialization angle. Society absolutely dictates which masks are acceptable and effective. But we must emphasize that male covert narcissists exist too, often struggling with rigid, toxic norms of self-sufficiency.
Absolutely.
For men, this manifests as introjective preoccupation, a rigid, paralyzing need for self-definition and perfection that prevents them from voicing emotional needs, leading to an intense, isolating depression.
It's a different flavor of the same core issue.
Exactly. But crucially, whether we are talking about male or female covert narcissists, or this concept of communal narcissism, where someone appears exceptionally caring, volunteering for every charity, always sacrificing, it is just another mask.
You don't believe the communal narcissist actually cares about the causes they serve?
I believe the core entitlement remains absolutely identical to the grandiose type. They believe they are morally superior to everyone else in the room. They are simply extracting narcissistic supply through the illusion of selflessness.
The currency is different.
The currency is different. Instead of demanding you admire their wealth or intelligence, they demand you admire their suffering and their morality. But the transaction is exactly the same. It is a hidden control structure.
As we synthesize these perspectives, I want to return to the core of my position. Covert narcissism is a tragic, closed loop of developmental trauma. Beneath the maddening behaviors, beneath the withdrawal and the apparent manipulation, there is a vulnerable child experiencing profound, terrifying isolation.
It is isolating.
They suffer from a structural inability to self-soothe, locked in a perpetual assessment mode, constantly running from a dreaded, undesired self. The tragedy is that their survival mechanisms destroy the very connections they desperately need to heal.
And I maintain that while that trauma may be the origin, covert narcissism operates ultimately as a highly sophisticated system of interpersonal control. By hiding their grandiosity beneath depression, humility, or victimhood, the covert narcissist subjects their partners to invisible, deniable manipulation.
Using the pain.
Using genuine pain as a shield to evade accountability, forcing those around them to constantly regulate their fragile self-esteem. The trauma is real, but it has been weaponized into a behavioral algorithm.
What we absolutely converge on, however, is the unique danger of this paradox. The distress of the covert narcissist is 100% genuine. The pain they feel in their brain is as real as a physical burn.
It is real pain. Yet it is simultaneously the exact mechanism used to manipulate and destabilize the victim. That is what makes it so incredibly difficult to identify and recover from.
Right.
The victim's own empathy is turned against them, used as the very tool to keep them trapped.
The human psyche possesses a profound, staggering complexity. Understanding these deep psychological layers, holding the tension between the very real trauma of the narcissist and the very real antagonism experienced by the victim, provides immense validation for those who have lived through this dynamic.
It really does.
It gives them the language to understand what happened to their nervous system. And there are even more layers in our source material for the audience to explore on their own.
Because ultimately, whether it stems from a wounded inner child or a need for dominance, the behavioral impact on the person sitting across from them is real, measurable, and deeply damaging.
It brings us right back to that weeping figure sitting across from you. The tears are real, the pain is real. But just because someone is drowning doesn't mean they won't pull you under with them. Thank you for joining us on the debate.